Okay, good morning, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started this morning. So today is the 23rd. And so what we're going to do today, really the only activity that I've got, and I'll spend as much time as really as you want me to, is to talk about the exam. So we're just going to cover exam 3 today and talk about what to expect. And if you have questions, this is a good time to bring your questions to us, to me, so that I can sort of go over what these are about. And then we're glad. So the third exam, we get a little bit better ink here. Third exam is going to be available. The exam is basically done. I just have to make it available, and I'll probably class. And so you'll have the rest of today, which is Thursday, Friday, Saturday through Sunday. So the exam it's going to be available in the Brightspace. Okay, so it's going to be due for submission by midnight, or I guess 11:59 is the time that we set on it. By 11:59 p.m., same as before, on Sunday the 26th. Okay, so you've got some time to do it. I know that in the past, students have said that they can sometimes go in and out of the exam. I don't know if you can do that or not. I know in the old Blackboard system, people try that, they would get locked out and then start over again. You may be able to. I don't know. I don't think I'd recommend it really, because sometimes just getting timed out is enough to lose your work, unfortunately. And sometimes we set these exams for longer time periods. People are sort of tempted to walk away for 15 minutes and do something and then come back, and the exam is, or their access is no longer there. So it's going to be 90 minutes in time. I think that's really plenty of time to do this, and you'll have all the resources available to you since it's an online exam, whether it's your notes from the class lectures or the videos. Videos might be hard to access during the exam itself in terms of just a time frame and sort of getting to what you want to see, but nonetheless, that's available for you to sort of back up and go in and review all that. So 90 minutes, and they're going to be same format as before, 48 multiple choice questions. Okay. The exam itself is going to cover chapters 11 through 14. So 11, 12, 13, and 14. 11, 12, 13, and 14. And so let's talk about what these are individually. This chapter 11 dealt with really sort of the very beginning of our transitioning into economic modeling. And in this part of the class, which I usually refer to these intermediate exams as course segments. And really the big thing on this is about economic theory. And chapter 11 sort of gives us the tools by which we can start to analyze theory, in particular the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, which is a little bit more than meets the eye, because I think there's a temptation to view that as being simply supply and demand that we first learned about in chapter 3, that represents any kind of micro model, whatever that model is, the market for shoes or clothing or whatever, and simply blowing it up to be the macro economy. That's not quite so true. So you might want to have a look at that and know what the determinants are that can shift aggregate demand. Basically, C plus I plus G plus or minus X of that. Those are the elements of demand. And then supply, we talked about this idea of why supply is up, aggregate supply is upward sloping in the short run. And it really has to do with this idea of sticky input prices, input costs. That it is. See, I made the mistake of using the word price, whereas we differentiate in economics between cost and price. Price is the final exchange value of a good in a market between buyer and seller, whereas the cost is the value of an input. So when we say that they're sticky, we say that it's if output prices are going up, then firms are willing to take advantage of that and supply more output. Why not? Every firm wants higher prices. That's sort of the nature of the beast. But if raising their wages, they'll do so. And again, the wage example is a very specific one, but it's a pretty good one, because I think it's one that we can all relate to. If you can keep your workers' wages level while you're raising the prices to your customers, it's a great formula. And so as a result, the supply curve is upward sloping. Eventually, though, what's going to happen is and it's not just wages, it's also other input providers, some of which you've locked into for a period of time. And so if you can take advantage of the stability of those input costs while being able to raise output prices, you'll supply more output. Eventually, however, those costs will catch up with you if there's an inflationary condition going on. That is, workers will want or need wage increases at some point. And when we say that workers demand wage increases, it's not always clear how that happens. We've talked about this in class a bit earlier, and that's the idea that workers usually don't go in and demand. When we say demand, it makes it sound like they're being very forceful. It's usually the fact that if they don't get a wage increase by the employer automatically on some, whatever reasonable basis is, I suppose that's wildly variable, then they'll simply go to some other employer, particularly in the era in which there are a lot of jobs available, as there are now. And this is one reason why we're seeing wages come up, not as quickly as inflation overall, but wages are coming up because workers are sort of moving around trying to find better opportunities. And so turnover is very high, but the unemployment rate is very low. So that's what chapter 11 covers. Chapter 12 covers the Keynesian theory, and we got into a bit of chapter 11 actually transitions us into Keynesian theory. So toward the very end of that chapter, there's a discussion about Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, who really was the first probably true macroeconomist back in the 1930s. And as I indicated when we were talking about this, that macro really didn't exist as a thing prior to the 1930s because there wasn't really a need to sort of say, hey, the macroeconomy is something. Because I think up to that time, the idea was, well, the economy itself is just simply an aggregation, a collection of all individual markets. And so all we're doing is we're simply saying the macroeconomy is just simply the collection of all. But Keynes is saying, no, it's something different because number one, it requires management. It requires garden tending. You've got to deal with certain things that micro individual players can't deal with, like a general slowdown in the economy that the economy can't get itself out of. And so I went into some of this discussion of the aggregate expenditures model in class. It's discussed in Appendix D, which I've said before, I'm sorry, Appendix B, excuse me, Appendix B, which I didn't assign as reading. And it may be the most challenging in terms of the technical models in the text. And so I thought it'd be easier just for me to describe this because then it leads directly back over. It brings us back to aggregate demand and aggregate supply, which we're going to be working with the rest of the semester in terms of modeling macroeconomic phenomena, problems, solutions. And when we get it after this exam, we're going to be talking about the rest of the course will primarily be dealing with policy. And again, policy is this is really whenever we use the term policy, we're practically always talking about government policy. Chapter 13 deals with the other sort of set of theories called classical theory, which takes much more of an optimistic view of the economy. If Keynes believed the economy was wobbly, unstable, prone to stickiness in terms of wages and prices, the classicists were saying, no, everything's fine. You just have to let things work themselves out. And so as a result, government intervention is not necessary. In fact, intervention is tantamount to interference. And we talked about some of the big names, Milton Friedman being the biggest of those by far. How Friedman said, look, if you get the government involved with something, they can never go away. You can't take down a government agency. It's got a perpetual lifespan. So as a result, government gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it crowds out private sector. It's inherently inflationary because it's creating demand for goods for which the supply side is unable to catch up, particularly in the very short run. So Friedman's work is important. We also talked about Friedrich Hayek a bit. I don't think there are any questions about Hayek on the exam, but he was one of the contemporaries of Friedman in the late 20th century who talked a lot about this idea of pushing back against Keynesianism. And we sort of group those latter-day classicists as what we call neoclassicists, because the term classical economics goes really all the way back to the 1700s. In the very, very beginning of economic thinking, to the extent that anybody was doing any kind of thinking about economic, it didn't exist for another 100 years or so after Adam Smith. And then chapter 14 was a nice sort of segue into where we're going to go after this exam. And it's a chapter on money and banking. And one of the last things I said in class on Tuesday was that there is an entire class on money and banking that for those of you who will want to go on and study finance, maybe not econ, but finance, which is a very common business school major, you'll probably come across a lot of this material again, only in much more detail than what we could do in an hour and 15 minutes. And it's pretty interesting too, because I think that banking and finance is mysterious to a lot of people. And to the extent that we can take down the mystery and make it seem, well, not make it seem, make it be more apprehendable to all of us, mentally, I think that's all to the good. Because I think that we've been sort of witness to the idea in the last, couple of weeks now about the fact that these banks are a very wobbly thing at all times. They're very unstable. I told the class about my first day in banking where we were addressed by a senior executive who said that banking is a house of cards. And of course, we all thought he was overstating the case, but they really are. If everybody wanted their deposits out, the money's not there. It's just not there. And so as a result, you can have a bank failure. And that's what happened in the case of Silicon Valley Bank. Everybody wanted their money out. Had they not wanted it out, that bank would probably still be around, and most of us wouldn't even know what it is. I had heard of Silicon Valley Bank only because a lot of stock analysts were sort of pumping it up for whatever reason. I had looked at it, and I wasn't very impressed with it early on, and I do sometimes invest in no banks, but Signature Bank I had not heard of. Signature Bank, First Republic I do know because I used to work for one of their subsidiaries. I do know First Republic, but they were a different bank when I worked there 20 years ago or so. So it's an interesting idea. This idea of the financial markets, the financial system, is being an integral part of the economy. It will sort of create its own little space in the circular flow model. And we'll do that after we come back from the exam next week. Okay, so that'll be where we lead in. It's a policy. We'll get into more policy after that. So what about the exam itself? So when we talk about aggregate supply, what are we talking about here? We're talking about the direct relationship between price and quantity supply, or price, I'm sorry, price level and GDP. Price level and GDP. And that is the idea that as output is rising and the price level is rising, there's a direct relationship between them because of the fact that what I said previously, the idea that sellers want high prices, and so as a result, they'll provide more output. If prices are falling, they'll provide less. So that's that direct relationship that exists. Okay. Also, no, but we did a lot of modeling with the GDP model in general, or the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and bringing GDP in on the horizontal axis. And I want to talk a bit more about that and sort of regain some of our modeling here and talk about what's going on, because we are, even though we first introduced this particular model here in chapter 11, we're going to be coming back to it again and again when we talk about economic policy. So here we're modeling the price level, not the price of a good, as in the case of the supply demand model in chapter 3, but the price level based upon some price index, whatever that is, CPI, GDP deflator, whatever. I know the Federal Reserve likes to use a particular index that's called the PCE deflator. Again, PCE simply being the long version of the P variable personal consumption expenditures. Whatever it is, usually starts at 100 and goes up. Then GDP on this axis here. And so again, aggregate supply responds in the short run. We sort of modify that. And sometimes it's called SRAS. And I guess I keep forgetting to look in your book to see how they label. I don't know if anybody here remembers how they label it. It's the same thing. It's just that, over time, you sort of get used to a particular symbology. And I guess that's kind of where I'm coming from. So, but anyways, the price level goes up. Firms are going to provide more output. As the price level falls, they provide less output. And over time, though, there's going to be a shift in this because if wages and prices, input prices, costs go up, firms are going to supply less output. And so as a result, we're going to have a shift to the left. And we went through that derivation as we went from short run aggregate supply to long run aggregate supply. One of the things we said was long run aggregate supply looks something like this. It's basically vertical. This is a classical school notion that I think is now pretty well accepted by everybody in the on both sides of the macro debate, theoretical debate. I think most agree that the aggregate supply curve is parallel to the price axis. And remember, whenever you have a graph like this, where you've got some value, it's either vertical or horizontal, vertical or horizontal. Let me get my directions right here. Vertical or horizontal, whatever it's parallel to, it's not influenced by. So it doesn't matter what the price level is. The GDP is going to be constant. Average supply is not going to be responsive in the long run to the price level changes. And so as a result, it'll stay where it is. And so we would simply refer to that as an equilibrium condition. And the classicists believe it's essentially that the condition of all times, aggregate demand coming at. And so as a result, this is a long-term equilibrium condition. Now, one thing about it is that if we're talking about GDP in general, then we need to know this is a long-run condition. But what if you've got something like this going on here, where you've got aggregate supply in the short run being upward sloping. Okay, aggregate supply in the short run being upward sloping, and you've got aggregate demand looking something like this, and yet you've got a GDP, a real GDP here, which is not full employment, but you're out here. Okay, full employment's out here. In other words, what do we refer to this as? we said this is the actual here, even though it's in equilibrium. Now remember, this is what Keynes was saying. What does equilibrium represent everywhere at all times? Stability in the short run. There's nothing's really changing, everything's moving along, and it's not fluctuating, it's more or less stable. And by the way, even back to chapter 3, we talked about the fact that we could pretty well support the idea of equilibrium. And in fact, in macro, we call it general equilibrium theory. That's the idea that sometimes you get variables that are relatively stable. They just don't move. Sometimes we see this with interest rates that just don't do anything for years and years. Now, we haven't been seeing that lately, but there are times when that happens. So oil prices are stable or employment is stable. So it can happen. But what Keynes in particular was saying is you have this gap here. And whenever you have a gap in a distance between actual and whatever the full employment is, you have what's called an output gap. In this case, it's because it's less, the actual is less. We simply call that a recessionary gap or a recessionary gap. And so any kind of distance. Now, if it were the other direction, if actual were out here, full employment were back here, we would say that's an inflationary gap. And by the way, that's kind of where we are right now, isn't it? Because we're operating at a very quick pace, very low unemployment rate. The unemployment rate, even though it went up a little bit last month, at least the last reading for February, still is well below what most economists believe is full employment. That is, we're drawing more people back into the labor force, and as a result, the unemployment rate ticked up a bit, but we've got more people working. And even at 3.6% unemployment, that's extremely low. We're probably at a point in which we're beyond full employment. And as a result, we would call it an inflationary gap, and we've got the inflation to prove it. And that's the story it has been. It's been a little bit of a concern, I think, to a lot of people in the econ world, because there's been so much coverage about these banks that it really overshadows the key story here, that's inflation. And the fact is the Federal Reserve just yesterday, no, 2 days ago. No, it was yesterday. My days are running together here. It raised interest rates by another 0.25%. And they're doing it because they're trying to slow the economy down. They're trying to do it gradually. My suspicion is they would have gone more, maybe 0.5%, had this bank crisis not welled up. I think they feel like time is on their side, that they've done a lot in a short time, about a year, really. About a year, they've raised interest rates about 4.75% above where they were for these short-term rates. And we'll talk about what those rates are. Let's not get overly worried about that. My point is, though, that inflation is the big story right now, and that's something that we will be dealing a lot more with from a theoretical and policy standpoint later. Okay, so what is full employment? Well, when we talk about full employment, first of all, we model it here as being full employment GDP, but GDP is a dollar figure. Okay, always, or it's a yen figure, or it's a peso figure, or it's a euro figure. It's monetarily based, but unemployment is a percentage of the labor force. Okay. So when we talk about full employment, we're saying, okay, look, if you consider the 3 kinds of unemployment, we go back to chapter 8, we had frictional, structural, and cyclical. And so when there's no cyclical unemployment, then we're at full employment. So 0 cyclical unemployment means full employment. Meaning what? That means we have some positive figure for frictional and structural. And we do. And no one's ever saying that we should have 0 unemployment, because it doesn't really make sense. It's like saying, we're going to have 0 pollution. That's the way it's going to be. No one's going to pollute. Well, good luck with that, right? Or there's going to be 0 auto theft. Well, that's never going to happen, right? There's always going to be some bad that happens. But if we can reduce the bad, then I think we've achieved the goal. And I know sometimes people would have this idea that we can take away all bad things forever. And of course, it doesn't really work that way. We can bring it down. That's just the nature of the beast. We can't ever get rid of plane crashes. We've done a pretty good job of making plane crashes practically impossible, but they still happen. Okay. Same with unemployment. There's going to be unemployment. We can't take it to 0. So think about that. No cyclical unemployment. Okay. Let me see here. I'm just kind of going through. The exam's mostly done. I just got to kind of make it available here. So what is aggregate demand then? We talked a bit about aggregate supply. What's aggregate demand? Aggregate demand is simply the demand for all goods and services in the economy. There's an inverse relationship between price and the GDP level. Why? Because we talked about this idea, and most of them having to do really with the price level. They're all sort of related to that. And that is, if the price level is falling, we'll demand more of the economy's output. If the price level, I think my boss Friday actually, so she's probably picking may think I'm blowing her off here. You're not know I'm in class, but anyway, I apologize for that. I usually, some instructors really get hardcore about phones in the classroom, and I'm usually I'm the biggest offender usually, so I have no room to talk here. So, all right, so if the price level is falling, there's more GDP demanded. If the price level is falling, there's less GDP demanded. Keep in mind, what does GDP equal? Gross domestic product. So if the domestic prices are rising, then it's a very good chance that we demand less domestic output and maybe a foreign produced alternative. And so we see this happening from time to time when we buy a lot of goods that are imported because they're less expensive, or we simply can't, not just because we can't produce them here, but because of the fact that they're less expensive relative to what we're producing here. Okay, so that's what's going on. The inverse relationship between price level and GDP is what characterizes aggregate demand. Okay. Any questions so far about any of this?
On aggregate demand, is that also correlated with the CPI now?
Well, the CPI is an index that would, well, yes, it's correlated on an inverse relationship. So the price level here is based on some index, an index that you're choosing, whether it's CPI or PPI or the GDP deflator. These are all examples of different indexes. And I know that we talked a bit about these in the second segment of the course, but it's whatever. It's like we say, it starts at an index value of 100. It's really the starting point, and then it sort of goes up from there. So it's inversely related to that. Okay. Okay, so what do I want to talk about next? Let's see here. Oh, okay. All right. So we talked about this idea of the Phillips curve, and the Phillips curve is an interesting theory in economics. It was probably considered, I think, standard dogma for a long time, and that was the idea. And by the way, it doesn't really matter if we plot the unemployment rate on one axis and inflation rate on the other axis. It doesn't really matter what axis we put these on here. Make sure I've got I'm trying to see what the screen looks like here. Oh, wrong way, my fault. So it's a downward sloping function here that basically, so say we plot unemployment on this axis, the horizontal, and put the inflation rate on the vertical axis here. You know, it doesn't matter if it's still going to be the same relationship. And the Phillips curve relationship was this. It was a downward sloping curve looking like that. And it really suggests what we would think of as a policy dilemma. And that is the fact that if you've got very high unemployment here, with very low inflation, like say unemployment is say 8%, which I think most of us inflation is say 2%, then maybe to speed the economy up, we would do things like cut taxes and things, increase government spending. So we would lower the unemployment rate to say 4%. But we also give up some inflation as a result. And that's simply this natural tendency to speed the economy up, but by doing it, we raise the price level, we heat the economy up. So it's this dilemma. We can reverse this too, going in the other direction. So the Phillips curve is this dilemma, really, that's facing policymakers in the very short run. And it says, look, you can pick your poison. You want more unemployment, more inflation, or do you want to be, or can you arrive at this sweet spot somewhere in the middle? I think that's really the objective. Because if we say, okay, what is the objective of macroeconomic policy at all times, regardless of where we are in the business cycle, it's non-inflationary economic growth, non-inflationary economic growth. So somewhere here in the middle would be the preferred area. If you're out here, you've got very low unemployment. If you're out here, you've got very high unemployment. But if you have very low unemployment, you tend to have very high inflation, very low unemployment, or very high unemployment, very low inflation. Workers and firms don't have much pricing power when there's a recession and high unemployment. Now, here's the problem with the Phillips curve, why it was looking like a pretty good set of theories. And by the way, it's based on observations. It's much more observationally derived than it is just simply thinking, okay, this is the way this is the way things work. And it's the idea that Phillips, primarily the US and Britain, in the 1940s and 50s, and sort of put the dots together and plotted this curve. The problem is that by the late 70s, early 80s, the entire curve was shifting in this direction, and meaning we had more of both. And this wasn't supposed to happen. This was a violation of the idea, and that was the whole thing was shifting. And we simply refer to that as a brand new term called stagflation. Stagflation is the idea of unemployment and high inflation at the same time. And this was considered such a big problem that people really needed to rethink why this could happen in the first place. So Phillips looked like it was a pretty good idea as to how the economy works. And in fact, I think in the short run, most economists believe there's a lot of value to it. It does break down over the long run. In the long run, we say the Phillips curve is essentially vertical, that it's not really responsive that much to the inflation rate, that unemployment is what it is, mostly because of things like technology and economic growth in general, population change, all that. Okay. All right. Let me see here. Just trying to get my see what's going on here.
Is it possible we might see stagflation?
Well, there's been some debate about it. I don't think so. I'd be very doubtful, really, because I think they're going to rein in the inflation situation. I mean, I think all indications are they'll succeed. The problem with the late 70s, early 80s is the Federal Reserve was not really aggressively fighting it, and there are a lot of reasons for it. Some of them, frankly, it turns out to have been more political than economic. And President Nixon in the early 70s did not want to fight inflation very aggressively because he wanted to keep the economy going. So as a result, he deliberately named a Fed chairman who probably wasn't up to the job, frankly, in hindsight. And so as a result, inflation really got away from itself, because in order to do that, to stop the inflation rate, the economy had to slow down dramatically. President Carter did name a Fed chairman who basically hit the brakes. And I think also in hindsight, probably a little bit too aggressively, threw the economy into a very deep recession. But so I don't think it's going to happen. I think the Federal Reserve, despite the fact that we had these crazy bank failures a couple of weeks ago, no depositor lost money. There's no real problem. Everybody will calm down. I think personally, there's just too many talking heads on TV, frankly, is what I think. Oh, the sky's falling, and it really isn't. Now, could I be wrong? Yeah, I mean, we could have a systemic bank problem, but it just doesn't seem like it. And if we would, and so I think the Federal Reserve is moving slowly on interest rates so that banks can adjust for it. Something this Silicon Valley Bank did not do. They violated a lot of important principles of banking, and so they should have taken my banking class before they took the job. So
They were talking about something like, and I want to know if this is that is an effect of the 2008 crisis. Is there's now insurance companies for all these banks for depositors who have assets higher, 250 or
right,
100,000.
right. Well, okay, so FDIC, you're talking about FDIC insurance. So FDIC insurance has been around since the Depression. It's basically guaranteeing depositors that if your bank goes out of business for whatever reason, you'll be guaranteed up to 250,000. But it's actually more than that, because you could have, I think if you're 250 in your name, 250 in your spouse's name, 250 together. I think another 250 for IRA accounts. That used to be the case. I don't know if that still is. But what I'm saying is it's a little bit more than that. But what the government did in the wake of these, just a couple of days within the failure, particularly of SVB, all depositors, everything. And some of these depositors had millions of dollars on deposit. I mean, millions. And to the point where it's like, okay, do these limits really mean anything? Because the government did the same thing in 2008 when Washington Mutual failed. That was the biggest bank failure in history. And of course, this in itself is a bit blown out of proportion, because the size of banks in the 1930s is nowhere near the size of banks in the 21st century. So say it's the biggest bank failure. Well, yeah, it was, but there are also more of us. It's bigger. And Silicon Valley Bank was the second biggest. But that wasn't a very particularly big bank. I mean, the fact that most people never heard of it could tell you something, right? If it were Bank of America that would fail, that's a whole different story. But this idea that we did the same thing with Washington Mutual, and with deposit limits that were still insured over and above that, do the limits really mean anything? I think that's an important question. And it's one that I think people are going to need to think about. Okay. All right. Let's see here. Okay, so there are a few questions dealing with graphs of the aggregate demand, supply model. And just think about what's being asked for in these particular graphs. Think about what would affect aggregate demand, things like tax changes, what would happen. And we are going to come in the policy section of the course in this fourth segment, talk more about that. But we said that one of the things that could shift aggregate supply would be things like taxes. And so if taxes go up, aggregate supply tends to to shift left, as does aggregate demand because there's less purchasing power. Also think about one of the things we talked about with the shift in aggregate supply was something called supply shocks. Supply shocks are simply these things which happen to an economy that sometimes aren't really even directly economically related, but do have an impact on the price level. For instance, something like the pandemic, for instance, which I think sort of kicked off this inflationary cycle we're in because it was really a leftward shift in aggregate supply. Remember, left as opposed to down, it's a decrease, and because there were a lot of people out of work, and so there's less supply being provided. And also there was, there were a lot of supply chain issues. We were all witness to that. So if anything, if anything good came out of the pandemic, very few good things, it may be the fact that it emphasized to everybody, laypersons as well as experts, just the fragility of supply chains, so that we are all tied together. And so if we can't get, things like paper towels or, even toys. I know buying my son, trying to find a toy for my son he really wanted. Turns out it's made in Australia. So, it took a while to get across the ocean. It's like, I never thought I had to worry about buying a toy and worry about supply chains, but you kind of get the idea that, that we're all sort of tied together. So being able to know what those dynamics are, supply shock is typically a leftward shift in supply, brings down GDP. And so we had a bit of a decline in GDP in the early stages of COVID, and we had a bit of a price bump. Price bump has sort of stayed with us. Okay. All right. Let's see, what else do we want to talk about here? And we're still talking here about aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Okay, well, know what happens when we have like these shifts in aggregate demand, aggregate supply. And I would just be comfortable, if I were you, to be able to drawing these things out. Sometimes it's just simply like it's, something that, oh, I have to do this, and so I must not really understand it. Because professional economists do this all the time. Hey, what would this look like if? And so just drawing it out. So as long as you know that aggregate supply is upward sloping, aggregate demand is downward sloping, just kind of, shift those and kind of see what might be happening. Okay. Also know about the idea of equilibrium and what that means. It's the same idea of equilibrium in the early model we talked about when we first talked about equilibrium. And it's the idea of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. But what does that mean from the standpoint of those two values? It's where aggregate supply and aggregate demand are equal. And so if we have the values for those, we can say, well, they must be equal at the equilibrium point. So whatever these dollar figures are, and it doesn't really, we don't really know, we care what they are, but if it's $20 trillion, whatever, it's $20 trillion of aggregate demand and $20 trillion of aggregate supply. That's an equilibrium condition. And we know that things get out of equilibrium on occasion. The question is what to do about it. And that's, we began talking a bit about that in this segment of the class. Okay. Okay, questions so far? All right, let me see here a minute. So you want to be able to know a little bit about what is going on with those kinds of things. Some of these I've covered before, so I'm just kind of flipping through here. Feel free to ask me any questions. If you're on the Zoom call, you can type something in the chat box, or just simply, you can say something if you like. That's a small enough group. You can do that. So let's see here. Okay, all right. I want to talk a bit about this idea of, okay, when we get into theory, the theory part of this, we talked about this idea that, okay, you've got these two broad sets of macro theories in the economy. And we refer to them as the Keynesian and the classical view. And they seem like they're irreconcilable. That is, how do you, think about just the assumptions that are made. And the Keynesians view the economy as being inherently unstable, particularly aggregate demand. They're unstable, and so as a result, government intervention is needed because the economy can get stuck in place below full employment. The classicists believe that the economy is mostly stable, and that if government gets involved, really all they're doing is simply, interfering, monkeying around with something that's probably going to fix itself in the first place. So is there a way to reconcile these? I think the way to do this is by saying that, look, Keynes has a pretty good explanation for when the economy is operating below full employment, and we'll call full employment somewhere out here. So why full employment? So anything below that, then, where Keynes is basically saying aggregate supply functionally is, well, we have ink here, so let me find a marker that functionally the aggregate supply curve is horizontal. Now I know that we're throwing a lot of different slopes at you here because we've had upward sloping aggregate supply, a vertical aggregate supply, now a horizontal aggregate supply. But all he's saying is it's a short run view. The aggregate supply in the very short run could be horizontal, meaning what? Meaning that you could boost aggregate demand over and over and over again, and all you're doing is raising GDP, but you're not raising the price level. Until you get to somewhere near GDP full employment, and then it starts to go and tick upwards. So then you have the long run aggregate supply. So this is really, and here, if you continue to add aggregate demand, all you're doing is raising the price level and not doing anything to GDP. So this is one way to sort of reconcile the differing views of these two sides. And so we basically call this horizontal portion the Keynesian region. Sometimes the Keynesian zone, you might see it. And this we simply call the classical or neoclassical region. Okay, and I think that is one way for us to be accepting of both sets of theories, that maybe they both work. It's just that they are more descriptive of different parts of the business cycle. So right now, it would seem like we are well above full employment, and we've got inflation going on. And so as a result, there are a lot of people in the econ world and elsewhere who are saying, look, we've been pouring on stimulus, and it's been, yeah, we can't really lower the unemployment rate much lower than what we've already got, but we can keep raising the price level, which is what we haven't seen happening. And, there's a lot of debate as to whether or not all the stimulus that went out, not just to households, but also to businesses, whether or not that was productive. And I guess you could say yes, because it got us to full employment, but now we've got inflation as part of the bargain. And we probably had both forms, both the cost push and demand pull that we talked about earlier in the course. It's not specifically going to be on this exam, but probably got both of those. And so I think there's a way to reconcile both Keynesian and classical views of this. Okay, so you want to kind of know about what's going on there with those particular zones. Okay. Let me see here a minute. Questions so far? Okay. You also want to look in you make sure you do the readings, okay? Because I know sometimes there's a tendency for people to skip over the readings, just thinking, okay, I've got everything I need. There are just maybe 2 or 3 questions that are directly derived from the readings themselves. They're not completely out of left field. They're not something that just are unrelated at all, but they may talk about some things that you want to know about that we just didn't really have time in class to cover it. So just make sure you kind of do that. Just make sure you're familiar with what's going on, because sometimes it's just another way of learning material. Sometimes we're better off being exposed to different viewpoints and different means of interpretation. Okay. Okay. Let's see here. I'm trying to move along and. And remember also that when we talk about Keynesianism versus classicism, that Keynes recommended doing something. He recommended a policy prescription, and that is government involvement. In the economy, he's most useful. He and his followers are most useful when the economy is operating below full employment. The classicists are saying not so fast. Let's not involve government here. Government does not need to be intervening in the economy in order to bring the economy to full employment. Okay. Okay, and so Keynes recommended, how do we get out of this government spending on whatever it is, highways, healthcare, support payments to people, expanded unemployment benefits, all these kinds of things. And by the way, these are all the things that have been done over time, particularly to support those what we call low to moderate income households. And that's things like healthcare support, unemployment support, food assistance. All of those things are really an outgrowth of Keynesianism. That is the idea of government being able to provide relief to the economy and to parts of the economy in general. Okay. Okay. Also know that Keynes believed the economy is unstable. Prices and wages are sticky. That's where that term stickiness comes from. Also, there's a term, and when I say read the book, there's a term called menu costs that I didn't get into in the chapter. Just know what menu costs are. Menu costs are basically it's like a menu in a restaurant where prices are going up so fast that nobody wants to change the prices because it costs more to change the prices on the menu than it does to get the higher prices in the first place. There are a lot of costs of inflation. That's one of them, which is why inflation is considered to be particularly pernicious. because it causes people to have to do different things. All righty, let's see here. I'm just, some of these I've talked about here, but okay, know also about the multiplier, okay? So when we talk about the multiplier, we talked about this a bit when we talked about stimulus to the economy generally, and that was this particular issue here, where if you've got and remember, we really talked about two multipliers so far in this class. We talked about the multiplier on spending, and that's the one that we're mostly focusing here on. Yes, I introduced the money multiplier on Tuesday, but there's no question about that. We're gonna come back to that in the next segment when we get really into a bit more of intervention in the financial markets. This was just sort of an introductory lead in on Tuesday. But the one multiplier that we did talk about was the consumption multiplier, and that is it's 1 over the MPS. And so if the MPS were, say, 0.2, 20%, we'd have a multiplier of 5. And so that would be the multiplier. And the multiplier is basically this. It is times the multiplier is going to give us the change in GDP. Okay. Now you can, I think your text phrased a different way, where if you simply divide both sides by the multiplier, you get delta Y over the multiplier equals the change in needed aggregate demand. It's the very same algebraic relationship. Just don't worry about that so much. So if the multiplier is 5, and we're looking to close an output gap of 200 billion, then we don't need 200 billion in new aggregate demand. We just need we need 40 billion in aggregate demand. That's the answer here. So 40 billion in aggregate demand will get us to that region where we get employment. This is the heart of the Keynesian argument, is he's saying, look, you don't need government to do everything. You just need to get a bit of a jump start. He called priming the pump, which is kind of an old school term for what you used to have to do with old engines like lawnmowers and whatnot. You used to have to inject a little bit of fuel injection, and that's what is going on here. But you don't need to do all the work. The private market will do it on its own. You just have to get the thing going. And the multiplier is this idea that because one leads to another, that the economy will eventually move its way to full employment as the result of successive transactions. Okay, so that's something to know about. And when we talked about this idea of the multiplier, we're saying that the economy is tied together. One transaction leads to another, okay? All right, so questions about that, okay? We talked a bit about the Phillips curve, so just know what's going on there. Also know about, among the differences between the two schools, Keynesian and neoclassical, is the fact that the Keynesians are much more concerned with the short run, the classicists, neoclassicists on the long run. That's among the disagreements they have. Keynes himself was famous for saying, in the long run, well, in the long run, we're all dead. So he's focusing on the short run. The classicists much more in the long run. That's an important distinction because it really does help to describe why there are differences in their particular approach and different sort of conception of how the economy works generally, okay? Well, the Austrians are part of the neoclassics. They're just part of the school. So when we talk about neoclassics, we talked about the different groups, the monetarists, which were headed by Milton Friedman. We talked about supply-siders. Milton Friedman or Martha Laffer was one of those. There's no question about the supply-siders here. Rational expectations we did talk about, and that's a particular group. And then the Austrians were just sort of a unique group, and they're so-called because they are from Austria. So. And they talked about this idea of real skepticism about government's ability, not even just whether we should involve government, but whether government is even up to the job of trying to control the economy. And I think there was lots of skepticism on the part of many in the Austrian school, Hayek being the big name there. Okay. So the classicists believe in the long run, the economy would operate mostly at full employment, or by the way, full employment and potential employment are the same thing. Your text uses the term potential GDP. It's the same as full employment GDP. These are all different ways of looking at it. We've got different, sometimes it's called the GDP that is at the natural rate of unemployment. Those are all saying the same thing: full employment, full utilization of resources. Okay. Also, another thing that we talked about is differences between classicists and Keynesians were the fact that Keynes was the first to say, hey, wages and prices are sticky. They don't move, they don't adjust flexibly. And it was one explanation for why unemployment could become a long-term phenomenon. One of those was the fact that workers, when faced with the idea of saying, okay, we all need for you to take a wage cut, or we can lay 20% of you off, the workers will prefer the 20% go, 80% will prefer 20% to go, and they keep their same wages, which it contributes to wage stickiness. And the reason why is what we call insider-outsider relationships, and that is the idea. And it makes sense if you're a worker who's been someplace for 10 or 15 years, why would you want to give up your seat to somebody who has just gotten there? And why would you want to give up your wages just to accommodate somebody who is brand new? And if you've got a family, then that's an easy one, to sort of reconcile in people's minds. Okay, so just got to be aware of what those are about. That is considered to be a fairly building block. The classicists believe that wages and prices are flexible; they will adjust. And in fact, one of the arguments here is that government doesn't need to do anything at all about unemployment generally. That may be an overstatement of the argument, but government should do it as possible, because eventually workers will take lower wages and they won't get the job they want, but they'll get a job and they'll get back to work, and the economy will cure the unemployment problem. But it will take time. They're focused on the long term. And also one emphasis is the Keynesians were much more concerned with unemployment as a policy thing to deal with, a problem, whereas the classicists were much more interested in inflation. Unemployment was the fixation of the Keynesians, inflation of the neoclassicists. Okay, all right, so let me see here. Okay. We're going to come back to M1, M2 a bit later. There are a couple questions dealing with chapter 14, and I'll get to that here in just a second. Okay. Some of these I've kind of gone over, and I'm just looking through my. Okay. Know about the rational expectations group and who they are. There's one question on the exam dealing with that. So, rational expectations is the term for a group of theorists, and Robert Lucas is one of the main characters here, where they talked about the idea that government policy tends to be less effective than what it is made out to be, mostly because of the fact that private actors do things to mitigate the effects of those. They do that because they want to make their own situation better. And so they get out well ahead of some sort of policy change in order to sort of mitigate the impact of that change. We talked a couple of examples that I talked about in class were things like a pending tax that you know is coming. You might do something ahead of time to mitigate the tax. And so as a result, the tax is less effective, whether it's a luxury tax. For example, I talked about that, and also the example of an inventory tax. If your inventory tax is coming, you should dial down your inventory so you pay less tax, meaning that you're trying to lower your own tax bill, in other words, better your own situation, but you make worse the overall problem with the government's need to raise taxes. And so it becomes less effective. This has also got monetary implications as well. And we'll get into that a bit in the next segment of the class, where there's a lot of evidence that the private market really understands where interest rates are going well ahead of the time, well ahead of the Federal Reserve. This rate increase yesterday was not a big surprise. There was a bit of tension over the last few days because a lot of people were wondering whether or not the Federal Reserve would hold off on the continued rate increases. Most of us thought, and it turns out that the interest rate future market, which I follow pretty relentlessly, they were pricing in this idea of a rate increase. And so that goes back to the rational expectation school. People are anticipating things, they're looking ahead, they're trying to see what it means to them. Okay. And in fact, it did pull off. The government did pull off what they expected to happen. Okay. Okay, and one of the difference between the classicists and Keynesians, where the Keynesians believe that the economy does not correct itself, that it needs outside intervention, i.e. the government. That is, it's like a garden needing tending. You're going to pull the weeds and add the fertilizer and whatnot. You've got to do things to make things work. The classicists are saying, no, the economy is generally self-correcting, that it will take care of its problems on its own. It does not need government to step in and be a big brother and all that. Of course, the neoclassicists get into some pretty extreme language at times, talking about the fact that, government's trying to hold our hand, or it's the nanny state, all these kinds of things. So that should tell you that they have a dim view, to say the least, about government involvement. And then there are a couple of questions that we dealt with from money and banking in chapter 14. Number one, this idea of money creation. And I went through an example in class on Tuesday about one process of money creation. Now we're going to come back to a more comprehensive view of that when we get into talking much more about the Federal Reserve. And I know I've been talking endlessly about the Federal Reserve, and it's unfortunate we don't really get into the mechanics of what it is, who they are, until fairly late in the class, but that's how important a role they play. But the Federal Reserve can create money out of whole cloth, because one of the things we said about money, the definition was that it's what we call fiat, it's just paper money, that's all it is. It's not even really paper money so much anymore, it's mostly entries in computer data banks, and it's not backed by gold and silver, in other words, or anything else. So you can't redeem it for something. Remember in the Friedman video we saw in class, that salt has been sometimes used as money, or at least backing for money. Gold has been used for centuries, millennia really, because gold's got one unique property: can't be destroyed, can't melt, can't evaporate, can't rust. And so it's been used, but it's also fixed in nature. And so the economy that's growing, if we tie the money supply to gold, we inherently have got an artificial problem. So that's the issue. So we allow money to be created both by the government and by banks. And we talked about this process of money creation. That is, a bank makes a loan, it immediately becomes new money in the economy. I know it sounds like something that's kind of mind-blowing in some ways. How can a bank loan be brand new money? Well, think about this. A bank is lending its reserves. The reserve is funded by the deposit, but the original deposit that funded that reserve doesn't go away just because a new loan is made, because that person who made that deposit wants their money back and they can go get it. So a bank makes a $10,000 loan, it's funding, it's taking someone else's deposits indirectly, but that 10,000 can become a new deposit somewhere else. I borrowed 10,000 to buy a car, so the person I bought the car from now has $10,000. Presumably they put it on deposit somewhere, but the original deposit never went away. So money creation, every bank loan is in the process of money creation. So to answer the question, okay, well, why doesn't money just go up, 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 up? It sort of does, but also every time you repay a loan, it works in the opposite case. Repayment of a loan takes money out of the system. So to know about that. And also we had a bit of discussion about a bank's balance sheet and what that was about. We said that the balance sheet, assets on one side, liabilities on the other. And I realize that in the accounting world, it's liabilities and capital, which balance out assets, but we're more interested in the asset liability equation. So somebody makes a deposit to a bank, it becomes a liability. And we hope that the bank considers it a liability, that they owe the money back to the depositor. But it's simultaneously an asset, because that money then becomes cash that they can use as what we call a reserve. And that reserve can be loaned or invested, or they can do whatever they want with it that's legal for them to do. So bank deposits, this is why banks like to get deposits, because they create not just a liability, but also an asset, and they can do with it what they please within the legal constraints they're faced with. So on the bank's balance sheet, loans and reserves and investments are all considered assets. The deposits are considered the liabilities. Okay, and I realize too that on that right side is also the balancing act of putting capital in there, but let's not worry about that. This is not a pure accounting course, but we do need to talk about the difference between assets, things which are owned, and liabilities, things which are owed. Okay. All right. I think that is all that I really had to offer with regard to the exam. I think we've covered all the major topics. Other questions that you have for me that I can answer? We've got about 15 minutes or so to 17 minutes, something like that.
You need to have like a big understanding of the loan and deposit cycle that we went over.
I think you want to know the cycle that goes like this. Okay, somebody gets paid. Okay, so you get money or cash or check or money order or whatever, and you put it on deposit at the bank, and that's a liability. And then that liability becomes an asset to the bank in the form of a reserve. And the reserve is an asset, and then from there it goes off to the two main areas: loans and investments, which are also assets. So all they're doing is they're converting that reserve, which is an asset, to these other assets. And so that's really the cycle there. And so loans are brand new money funded by the reserve, which is funded by the So whether it's a cash or check or money order or wire transfer, whatever it is, can all become a bank deposit. So you kind of want to know a little bit about that whole process because it's not always obvious to people. In fact, the very term Federal Reserve is the idea that the Federal Reserve, among the various functions, is it serves as the reserve for banks. It's the banker's bank. So, and we'll talk more about this idea of required reserves. I got into this a bit on Tuesday and we talked about the money multiplier. I just wanted to throw that out there just to show the process of money creation also works through a multiplier, very similar to this, but it's got to do with money. And we're going to come back to that in the next segment. But the reserves of this idea that a bank has got a certain amount that it can use to lend or invest, and it's funded by the deposit function primarily. Okay. Okay. Any other questions for me? Anybody on the Zoom call want to say something? Because you can feel free to. I know there were a half dozen or so on the call, and or there were. Okay. Well, so it'll be available sometime probably this morning, and you'll have the opportunity to look at it from there. If you have any questions about it, feel free to get with me. I'm in and around all weekend, so feel free to send me an email if you like. Ask any questions you would like about the exam, and I'm more than happy to help. So good luck with it, and again, if you have questions, feel free to let me know. So good luck on that. Have a great weekend. See you next time.